Thank you so much. I thought that was wonderful. And I love the Waterhouse. It's such a the complexities of that picture so neatly kind of sum up the kind of conflicts that you're talking about. And it's also, it's a wonderfully sort of funny picture as well, isn't it? With it, when you start kind of putting those elements together, the women sort of teasing or kind of demanding attention from Diogenes, who's having a sulk in his barrel. It's you're cited. It's in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Have you seen it in person?
No, I haven't seen it in person, I'm afraid. So by Jérôme, in which which has the same shot, as it were, of Diogenes, but it puts it much more centrally in the canvas. And what is interesting is that Waterhouse kind of miniaturizes that painting and shoves it on the side, and then he adds the element of the fashionable women, as it were. So what is interesting here is also, I think, the dialogue that he has with French academic paintings and with the ideas of citizenship that tradition kind of references here, and how that idea of citizenship is here very much put in dialogue with this idea of in a way of the emancipated woman, which is very much, a fin de siècle concept in its own right, and of women themselves kind of having claims to citizenship, through, as we know, kind of, the crusades for social emancipation, that, we go into suffrage, etc., and how that crusade, that kind of emerging sense of woman citizenship is linked also to the idea, to consumerism, to the idea of an identity that's based on the idea of acquiring stuff. And obviously in the context of late Victorian Britain, that kind of that sense of consumer identity is very much linked to the empire, especially when we in this case, where the signifiers of luxury are to do with imperial trade, with world roots, as it were, world roots of trade.
Yeah. I'm struck very much looking at that. I don't know if I should show that painting just so that people can see what we're talking about again. Oh no, it's the wrong one. Okay, can you see am I showing the painting now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, you are.
One of the things that I'm struck by. I should say, whilst we're talking, please do be typing questions into the Q&A box. It's I think at the bottom of the screen, or usually, or maybe at the top of the screen if if I've got screen sharing on. So one of the things that strikes me, and that's wonderful about the painting in some ways, is I mean what you describe, a very lively sense of anachronism in there, that the ladies are in these kind of, the Japonisme of the parasols, and some of the aspects of their dress is to do with kind of contemporary artistic trends in the 19th century. One of the things it reminds me of is towards the end of the Decadence in Translation project, as a group we went to see an exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay of paintings related to the art criticism of the French writer Jacques Huysmans. Now, Huysmans is very, very dismissive of academic French painting. And one of the reasons he's dismissive of some of it is because of the sort of the inadvertent anachronism. So there's a painting, I can't remember who it's by now, of the murder of the Emperor Commodus. And Huysmans' sort of take on that painting is to make fun of the murderer because he looks like he's a masseur in a swimming costume, and he provides a sort of redescription of the painting that draws out, the ludicrousness of the posing in the picture, and then describes it in anachronistic terms to sort of pick at the thinness of the kind of classical influence in these neoclassical paintings. But actually, the point of this painting, I think, seems to be that dialogue between now and then, between the world and objects, the refusal of the world, and all those things that you're talking about. I think it's truly wonderful. I'm afraid that was one of those kind of conference questions that was more of an observation than a question. But I do have a question though, just to set things off, because I came to cosmopolitanism working with you on decadence. One of the things about decadence is that as a term, it's very pejorative. I mean, that decadent societies are societies that have collapsed. It's a term used historically to describe the collapse of the Roman Empire. But we find in the kind of second half of the 19th century, some writers picking it up as a badge of pride. So, for example, at some point, I think in the 1880s or 90s, Pater describes a fine and comely decadence in one of the artworks he's looking at. So he turns around a term like that. And I wonder if do you see a parallel between cosmopolitanism as a term and decadence as a term for thinking about these things, and that kind of pejorative association?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Matthew. I think yes is the short answer to that, and I think very much. I think you're absolutely right in what you say about the history of decadence. That is something that's formulated negatively, and then it becomes kind of appropriated, as it were, by decadent writers as a positive a source of positive identification. I should also say that at the same time, this tradition of kind of us repeating in a way these negative formulations of decadence obscures the fact that, as we know, from our network, etc., decadence is also incredibly productive at creating those sorts of international links that are fundamental for the flourishing of literary cosmopolitanism, and that's true both in its 19th century kind of reincarnation, as it were, and in its positive formulation, its kind of historical formulation, is historical, I should say, embodiment in the late antique period. Because of course the history of decadence as a word is that it's a word, it's a concept that's very much part of an 18th century and then 19th century historiography of thinking about classicism and giving it kind of building a narrative of classical civilization as rising and then falling again, right? Of course, however, that period that historians then deemed to be the period of decline of classical civilization has been then thoroughly questioned as being a period, in fact, in which classical civilization simply changes. For example, the locations of it change, right? So we no longer have big kind of its centers are no longer Athens and Rome. They are, in the East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Alexandria, and then in Byzantium, etc., places in which are very much engaged in the preservation of what went on before, but also in creating new contaminations. And in a way, that the idea of contamination is something that is very present in negative definitions of decadence, but it's something that we, I think, very much kind of push back against in terms of thinking, in terms of wanting to envision it as something positive, as something constructive. And I think in that way, cosmopolitanism is strictly linked to that. I also like the fact that you mentioned Pater there as example of somebody who rescues that word decadence and tries to overturn thinking about the comely decadence, because Pater himself also talked about cosmopolitanism, although very, very briefly and elusively, as he sometimes does, in one of his very latest writings. That's the essay that he wrote as an introduction to a new translation of Dante that he published, I think, in 1892. And there Pater gives a brief definition of the 19th century. And one of the words that he uses to define the 19th century is cosmopolitan. He says, we live in a cosmopolitan age. Now that's strange, because Pater, for all his career, had never used that word. All of a sudden, in the 1890s, he uses that word very pointedly to think about, about modernity, really, about the characteristic of modernity, and to use it in a completely positive way. So I think that's interesting. Pater was not somebody who used words lightly, and I think that there he was picking up vibes about transformations of this concept. And just very briefly, on the other hand, when I mentioned people who surprised me for using the word negatively, one of the people who routinely uses cosmopolitan in a kind of negative way is the writer Vernon Lee, right? Somebody who we would think of otherwise as deeply embedded in cosmopolitan networks, very committed to a cosmopolitan idea of culture, but she uses it to mean superficiality, to mean the inability to root yourself even as a writer. So when she corresponds to an Italian writer called Carlo Placci, who was a kind of very minor kind of journalist stroke writer of the fin de siècle, not a name that would be at all familiar to readers in Italy especially today, she kind of berates him, as she often did to younger people, for being cosmopolitan. She says, what makes you interesting, your cosmopolitanism is also what disables you from writing, because you cannot understand and kind of in depth the experience of, you cannot understand, for example, moral ethical positions. You cannot understand social structures in depth, because you always skim on them, right? As a cosmopolitan.
We've got some. That's pretty. Thank you so much. We've got some comments in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Sean Reynolds has said more a comment, but I was going to raise women's citizenship. At the Founders Circle, they were almost universally citizens of nowhere, as are the Greek women in the Waterhouse painting. But they were for the first time setting up international associations like the International Council of Women in 1888, of which Lady Aberdeen, Scottish connection, was for many years president from 1899. These were often elite women, frequent flyers, but also marginalized in histories of cosmopolitanism or patriotism. But we also have a question about the role of women in cosmopolitanism from Jane Desmarais. And what I might do, if it's all right with Jane, I don't know if this is acceptable to Jane, I might promote her to panelist so that she could ask her question herself. I hope that's okay. I'm just going to give Jane just 30 seconds while I make that switch.
That's very technologically advanced.
Let's see if this works. I hope this is okay. So if I'm promoting Jane to be, oops, does that work? Has she popped up? Be rejoining as a panelist, so she should. So Jane, if you want to unmute and open your video, you could ask your question if you'd like.
Hi.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, nice to see you. I have a question. I just wondered about the structure of the painting, Waterhouse's painting, and I was thinking about it in its geometric structures, the circle, the triangle, the rectangles, and I wondered if embedded in that geometric structure there was a critique of cosmopolitanism, because Diogenes is in this circular cave-like, lightless space, whereas the women are in an elevated public space. And I just wondered whether, because you mentioned that the painting presents clashing visions, I just wondered if it also contained a critique of cosmopolitanism. Because I find it a rather confusing set of spaces, particularly in the context of that sort of late Victorian classical painting. It's a rather strange conflation of spaces. I just wonder what you thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant observation. I think I totally agree. It's actually making me see the painting in a slightly different way. So on the one hand, the kind of the confusing spaces feeling, which I share, I think is also a product of the fact that he's kind of, as I said before, literally kind of shoving in a detail from a painting and kind of, it's doing a kind of a collage there. But very much you have the sense of Diogenes representing, kind of, you have the kind of the roundness, like, that kind of looks like a globe, right? The citizen of the world kind of enclosed in his own globe, which is in darkness. That to me seems to be very, very strongly there, whereas the women are kind of almost on a path to enlightenment, to light, to not being scared of the world, right? So he's kind of this self-enclosed, yes, in this kind of self-enclosed universe, whereas they are both in the light. But to me, what's very strongly there is that they it's almost like he's rejecting the world at the same time, right? He's rejecting, of course, the world, the material world. There, he doesn't have possessions. He didn't wear any clothes. Like, obviously, this is kind of a Victorian kind of prurient depiction of Diogenes, who should be kind of wearing nothing at all. There, whereas they are, they represent a kind of more, you could say, more Baudelarian kind of idea of the cosmopolitan. This is in the painter of modern life, as somebody who is in the world and wants all of the world for themselves, right? So this desire to be of the world is very much, kind of associated with modernity, and he is very much associated with antiquity, with something that is kind of philosophically kind of elevated, but at the same time also outside of modernization. So I suppose that another way of formulating the kind of clash that you're also seeing here is one between modernity and antiquity, or modern and ancient, modern and classical versions of what it means to be a world citizenship. Yeah. Great.
It's a very complex painting, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Yes, it's one of these paintings that the more you kind of forced to look at them, the more things kind of emerge from it, but also kind of self-contradict in a very interesting way. Just to go back to kind of link this up to the previous question about women's kind of struggle to be in the public sphere, let's say, in these places, in this time, and to kind of to create their own kind of cosmopolitan networks. That question made me think of Virginia Woolf's two Guineas, right? In Woolf, kind of obviously kind of about 30, 40 years later than this material, will famously write, she's talking about the ascent of fascism. She's talking about the build-up to the Second World War. As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. So she's kind of thinking back of this history of the women's exclusion from institutions, from the institutions of citizenship, really, and trying to think about how that can be turned into a ground, a kind of a position, a strong position for critiquing those very institutions, those very kind of networks of privilege. So again, the idea of the citizen of nowhere as this paradoxical position of exclusion, but at the same time of clarity, of privilege, a privileged outsiderism. And certainly, thinking about class, again, the point that was raised by the first question, Woolf is very much in the same trajectory, as it were, of middle class women. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do, I don't mean to be rude to Jane, but I'll demote you now if I can. Actually, I don't know how to do that. Here we go. Change role to attendee. Okay. So there are a couple more questions. There are some more questions on the Q&A. I'm going to collapse a couple of them together, if that's okay. So there's a question from somebody, Russell. I'm not sure, I haven't got Russell's surname. Hello, and thanks to Stefano for his talk. Forgive my ignorance, but I wondered, as well as Waterhouse, which other artists were addressing the idea of cosmopolitanism in their work at the fin de siècle. And secondary to this, are there examples of female artists addressing the subject? So I guess, I mean, you mentioned Wilde, Lafcadio Hearn, and George Egerton in your talk. Yeah. But they're literary writers. But are there other artists that people could look to for cosmopolitanism?
I have to think about the artists, the women artists question. Let me think. Nothing comes to mind straight away. But in terms of the wider art scene, I would say that, yeah, you can find kind of lots of examples of this. Of course, I think what's important here is that just as so two things. First of all, that visual media, such as arts, and just like music, have a different relationship to cosmopolitanism than literature because of the allegedly more universal quality of the visual medium, meaning that while writers are bound to national languages, and they are bound by the fact that they have to be translated in order to communicate to readers from other languages or across the world, and that literature is always limited in its reach, no matter how canonical it is. It's not universal, it cannot be kind of immediately appreciated, so it has these boundaries almost kind of inbuilt within its medium. The visual arts are not like that. So that when we look at paintings or forms of applied art, or whatever other visual material you want to think about from this period or any other period, we also, in a way, we have to do a different thing. We have to think about how, in fact, that supposed universality of the gaze, right? Of the visual medium is in fact itself locally and nationally constructed. In other words, we have to renationalize to kind of to the visual objects in order to reconstruct their relationship to cosmopolitanism. I don't know if that makes sense, but absolutely the material culture and the visual culture of this period are saturated with desires for global connections, for international connections, etc. And that's certainly kind of a path into these images to see how they deal with bringing in kind of ways of seeing the world from different perspectives, from different places. Just as kind of a very short example, very well-known one, is the art of Whistler, right? A painter who, a little bit like Waterhouse is doing that, but in a much more kind of challenging way, in many ways, is also incredibly interested in the visual and material culture of Japan. But Whistler will not only incorporate objects that come from Japan into his canvases, so objects that signify travel, signify kind of desire for kind of for connecting with people far away, etc., etc. Also desires for material possession, but he will often also adopt the types of perspectives or techniques that come from traditional forms of Japanese art in order to defamiliarize our own way of looking at a landscape and looking at an interior, etc. So that the very interior that seems to you familiar, or the very landscape that is familiar to you, like, I don't know, the London, the Thames embankment, becomes strange, becomes kind of twisted through kind of the putting you in the position of the foreign eye, right? Kind of making you try to make you see that through foreign eyes. So that's one of the other ways in which this kind of cosmopolitan defamiliarization operates in the arts of this period, I would say.
I don't want to put Michael too much on the spot, but I'm very aware that my own knowledge of art history is quite limited. But I'm also aware that when Michael and I were talking about materials to go on the Scottish Cosmopolitanism website, he had some really good suggestions of fin de siècle female Scottish artists. And I don't know if you want to kind of address that part, Michael, at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it goes back to what is cosmopolitanism and trying to define exactly what that word means. Because I think there's certainly, depending on some definitions of cosmopolitanism, you could think of someone like Margaret MacDonald, who is drawing from so many different international influences, but then also is becoming very influential in places like Vienna and on Gustav Klimt. So I think there's definitely space to think about Margaret MacDonald as cosmopolitan on similar terms. I think Jessie and King fits into that context as well. But it does go back to this question. It's one I think Francis is raising in the Q&A on how do we distinguish between these terms, or can we distinguish between the likes of cosmopolitanism, transnationalism, internationalism, globalism? I mean, are these words synonymous, or are there slight distinctions? So I suppose a question I have on that front, just for Stefano, is in the 19th century, are these terms being distinguished from each other in a way that today, we are kind of thinking about how they might be distinguished? Do you have any sense of, for instance, if cosmopolitan means something different from international or transnational?
Yeah, great. I mean, that's a great question, actually, very, very important as well, because I mean, in a way, as I said, the term cosmopolitan to us carries these connotations of, of privilege, of worldliness, of fashion, etc. And critics, especially on the left, have really kind of tried to distance themselves from it because of that. But that's something that was true, I think, also at the time. So, for example, within socialist milieus, which, as we know, were very influential and very active around the turn of the century in that period, I think that in those milieus, the word cosmopolitan was already, as it were, tinted with that kind of bourgeois sensibility. So they were kind of using, they were certainly preferring to use the word international to the word cosmopolitan because of that, to avoid that kind of sense of bourgeois identity, right? on the other hand, cosmopolitan is something more than just international, right? You know, because the word is kind of, because of its very blurriness, I think it's got its strengths, especially for literary studies, because it's a word that it's a concept that that is very much about individual identity, that is very much about desire, right? In a way that international really isn't. And while the word transnational, on the other hand, is something that people didn't use at the time, I don't know when that came into being, it's certainly something that people use within literary studies today. So I prefer kind of, it's not a word, let's say, that you can use to kind of, it's a word that you would have to apply anachronistically on the 19th century, and so it's not a word that you can study to see kind of the sensibilities, the projections, as it were, that were made onto the idea of cosmopolitanism. What I would also say, however, to this question, which, as I said, is very important, I'm kind of, in a way, thinking back of Raymond Williams and his work. Keywords, right? You know, when he kind of thinks about important concepts, and nationalism and internationalism are two of his keywords. I would say that cosmopolitanism and nationalism are not simply oppositional terms, right? Just like cosmopolitanism and imperialism are not kind of oppositional terms, there are overlaps between these ideas. And whilst cosmopolitanism is indeed, and the idea of world citizenship, a rejection of lots of assumptions and points of view and tastes and political ideas that go with nationalism, the two can also inhabit. And I think that may be something that one could maybe see in the Scottish context. I mean, I'm kind of, as I said, you know, this is not my area of expertise, but it's something that I found is true, for example, of Irish writers in my period. People like Wilde or people like George Edgerton, etc., who were Irish, also had a difficult identification with Ireland. And while they certainly had what you could call cosmopolitan sympathies and practices, etc., they could also, at strategic time, kind of show a nationalist identity. And that's because, obviously, within the context of empire, within the context of complex kind of nations, such as Great Britain, etc., you have kind of different kind of nationalism is also associated with discourses of resistance to a kind of larger national kind of supranational structure, as you could think of Great Britain or of the British Empire, which can be cosmopolitanism can go together at the turn of the century without the two clashing in the way that you would otherwise think. And that's something, again, that you can see with the experience of India and of Tagore, right? You know, thinking about a positive nationalism, which is not a rejection of cosmopolitanism at all. In fact, a nationalism that is a path towards cosmopolitanism, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was great to see you referencing Tagore as well, because I imagine he'll come up in these discussions through his friendship with Geddes and the kind of similarities between the Scottish and the Bengali Renaissances.
Yes. The other little connection that I wanted to little, kind of enormous connection that I wanted to mention is the one between Goethe and Carlyle, right? You know, kind of one of the things that, you know, I didn't go into at all in the talk was ideas of world literature, right? And how those are also, that also is a pathway between the 19th century or and our own present, where literature also for us means a lot of things, and it also had a lot of kind of generative possibilities for people in the 19th century, and how Goethe formulated the idea of world literature very often in conversation with Carlyle, right? You know, and in the context of his own reading, for example, of the Edinburgh Review, etc. In other words, there is a kind of specifically Scottish experience to the dialogue that then becomes formative of world literature, and that's something that I think, I mean, as far as I know, people have not kind of investigated explicitly, and something that could be, I think, incredibly interesting to do.
Absolutely.
I think we've addressed there some of the points that Frances Fowle raised in her Q&A, which addressed that question about cosmopolitanism or transnationalism. I think you started to talk a bit about the literary context there as well. There are a couple more questions before we finish up. I wonder if it's all right to, there's a question from Alex Thompson, which I think crosses over with one from Julia Ditter about forms. If it's okay, Alex, what I'm going to do is I'm going to promote you to a panelist as well, like we did with Jane, to give you a chance to ask you a question. So you're now a panelist, and you're muted, and your video is off. So if you'd like to ask your question, you can do it. Alex, I should say, is one of the roundtable discussion participants in the next session at 1:30. Hi, Alex. Good to see you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I think you had a question about cosmopolitanism, defamiliarization, formal innovation at the founders here.
Yeah, so it's a kind of two-half question. Just to say, Stefano, this is really fascinating and interesting material. Can't wait to read the book, and I'm finding your approach incredibly kind of compelling and congenial to my own. And I really wanted to invite you just to say a little bit more about what you said in your final section of your talk about the relationship between artistic cosmopolitanism in relation to, I guess, to the idea of traveling styles, or the way that the kind of relation between styles can trigger formal innovation in an artistic mode or practice, which seems like a relational conception of a stylistic cosmopolitanism, which can be easily ported between contexts and might help us think about the Scottish kind of connection. But what I'm also, so I'd love to hear more about that, basically. But my sort of footnote, or my kind of rider, is the degree to which that artistic cosmopolitanism is then politically neutral, in the sense that it need not forward a particular set of values, but like a lot of, like the sort of the general models of formalist, kind of patterns in at this period, which feed into the 20th century, it's actually perhaps even detached from the idea of the World Republic of Letters now. And I'm kind of thinking about the way that the audience for art, the collection of it, the kind of its dissemination as a kind of high bourgeois product in imperial centers might actually contribute to that. So it seems like a really powerful moment to think about what's going on, but that there are two different processes.
Yeah. I mean, thank you very much, Alex. That's fascinating. I mean, of course, I think you've already kind of formulated it so fully that, I can only maybe add a couple of kind of practical examples or something like that. I mean, first of all, I think one of the points that you touched upon there, which resonates with me a lot, is the idea of thinking of a cosmopolitan kind of literature, cosmopolitan body of writing, not necessarily associated with, high art, right? There is also a kind of another level at which texts circulate internationally and become incredibly important for the formulation of these cosmopolitan identities we're talking about, for facilitating those exchanges that we talk about, etc., that are not kind of great literary texts, etc., right? By writers that we now associate as the kind of most kind of canonical of the period, whatever. So that there is this this broader spectrum that we need to think about, this broader relationship between kind of cosmopolitanism, literature, and society and social identities. So that's one thing. The other thing is that from what you were saying, it brings to mind the incredible importance of kind of silent mediators in these histories of cosmopolitanism. I'm thinking, for example, here of translators, of people who work in newspapers and kind of foreign correspondents, etc. So people who, in a way, in this period, who become increasingly professionalized in this period, right? So the kind of, for example, again, the institution of the foreign literary correspondent, right? That newspapers and certain types of kind of cultural reviews have, and how it becomes a specific type of literary identity to be somebody who can communicate local experience on an international level or a foreign level, etc. So that figure kind of becomes kind of important, is often very difficult to reconstruct. We are of course still operating in a period in the late 19th century where translators' names are often omitted from books altogether. So we are also dealing with a complex archive where this kind of world citizens within this kind of Republic of Letters, as you're saying, kind of are also strangely invisible sometimes, right? Because they do very important work, but work that's not remunerated, work that does not carry, their name on a title page. So we're kind of rubbing against that. And in terms of literary form, I referred before to a practical example, is my other writer, as it were. I mean, George Edgerton, who's already been mentioned, is already a very good example, because she was, as well as somebody who is often mentioned as a formal innovator of the period, somebody who looks forward to modernism, who has this kind of jarred, kind of complex, kind of style full of gaps, etc. She was also a translator. She translated from Swedish and Norwegian, and she read those kind of literatures very extensively at a time where literatures from Northern Europe were kind of circulated more widely than ever before. They were kind of attracting interest because they were considered to be at the forefront of technical innovation, but also of thinking about, for example, the role of women in society. We all know the role of the kind of the reputation and the history perception of Ibsen, but all kind of other Scandinavian writers could be mentioned. And I'm convinced that Edgerton's own experience of translating then transferred directly onto kind of making her style experimental. Like, the strangeness of her writing is partly to do with the experience of translation, right? That goes back. And the same could be the same, but a slightly different story for one of the other writers that I kind of talk about in this book, who is Lafcadio Hearn, somebody who spent an awful lot of time, the whole of the 1890s in Japan, who became a Japanese citizen, etc. And again, somebody who very much inhabits that role, which is not, the top kind of canonical position of the great kind of writers of the fin de siècle. Hearn was very concerned with how does one translate the experience of kind of encountering Japanese tales, Japanese folk tales, Japanese ghost stories, etc. And he often kind of inserted chunks in transliterated Japanese into his stories, or made some of his characters, kind of Japanese characters, speak in a kind of slightly weird syntax that somehow covered, kind of approximated, Japanese syntax, as it were, in English. And his writers in England and America, his editors, were absolutely horrified by that kind of stuff, because they thought we could put readers off because it's difficult to understand. It was absolutely adamant that defamiliarization had to be in the text, because the text should not be all comprehensible, because if you were in Japan, things were not comprehensible, right, to you. So so that's another example. Now, how that shades into Orientalism and other kind of problematic areas is an entirely different topic.
That's a brilliant segue, because in fact we've got a couple. I want to say thank you for that. We've got a question about exactly that issue, but I want to give Alex just did you want to reply, or was that?
No, that was really helpful. But I mean, the point about translation is, again, I think is just fascinating. One of the things that I've done a lot of work on is Stevenson's work in the decade before. And one of the key features of his style and his essays is that and inevitably writing footnotes, you find out these tiny details. You find an odd expression, and it turns out that it makes perfect sense when you realize he's just taken a French phrase and is Englishing it. And it kind of textures his work in conjunction with deliberate archaism, but also use of slang, all kinds of different vocabularies. So I think that's right. It's really be a really powerful pathway to kind of envisage cosmopolitanism through the ambiguity of translation. But no, thank you. It's a great answer.
Absolutely. I mean, no, thank you. And, how many writers were also translators? Kind of we often, kind of forget that and kind of shove that side of their work to the side, because again, it's not the kind of thing that's anthologized, that's studied. Often it's not considered creative in the same ways. But when we kind of put together the two identities, I think some very interesting stuff comes up there.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna turn Alex back into an attendee for now. So thank you, and we'll see Alex in just over an hour's time for the round table. There's a couple more questions, and then I think we'll draw things to a close. And the first question is actually from Alex Murray, who asked exactly the point that you raised at the end, though, which was, how do we negotiate between the cosmopolitanism of writers like Wilde and Symonds and then the Orientalism of their work and lives?
Okay, so that's yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, a really important question. I mean, we've obviously come to, we've all kind of in a way grown up with the Saidian paradigm of being extremely suspicious of Orientalism for good reasons. But I think it's also important to try and reevaluate some of the Orientalism of the period as kind of an honest kind of curiosity, let's say, right? So in some ways, I think therefore we should be kind of suspicious of simplifying the Saidian point and thinking that all Orientalism is kind of politically regressive. On the other hand, we should keep some of that suspicion to see, to keep critical distance from our material. So for example, if we go back to Waterhouse, I would say that the more pernicious side of the Orientalism there is to do with the way in which cosmopolitanism and free trade capitalism seem to collapse into each other without kind of naturally, as it were. That kind of natural is what I think we should be suspicious of. On the other hand, we should, I think, investigate the roots and the mechanisms through which knowledge about Asia, Asian cultures, Asian arts, etc., in this particular context, came to a writer to an artist like Waterhouse, or to a writer like Herm, etc. So just to kind of, in a way, kind of simplify an incredibly complex question like the one that Alex is asking, is that I think we should kind of critically kind of investigate the notion of Orientalism, not just kind of simply go back by default on a kind of Saidian position about that, keep the lessons of Said, but also keep looking at this incredibly fascinating body of writing. I'm thinking, for example, of Pierre Loti as well, another writer from this period who wrote, about the Far East, but also about India, but also about the Middle East in very kind of interesting ways, and who has, for similar reasons, had a long period of, has long been rejected within literary studies because of our suspicious, kind of rightful suspicions of Orientalism, but is being looked at again. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Sophie Bash, one of the people who was involved in a network on decadence and translation, on trying to reread that type of 19th century Orientalism, rehistoricizing, recalibrated in a kind of post-Saidian moment. Yeah. Thank you for this question. It's very important.
Brilliant. Thank you. So the last question from the Q&A, I think, and we'll probably make this the last question of this session, is from Petra Reed, and I think it's a question sort of that touches on something that I think is going to be a recurring thing over the course of this project in these sessions today, which has to do with thinking about the 19th century and how thinking about the 19th century relates to the present moment, why it's relevant, or to some people, for some motives, to be thinking about cosmopolitanism now. And she says, regarding the pejorative sense of decadence, would you have any observations on the irony of the new cosmopolitans, immigrants risking so much for what are often technology-enabled dreams of material goods available in more materially prosperous countries? And there, I think she's drawing a connection, I think, to the present moment and thinking about cosmopolitans through that idea of the new cosmopolitans. Do you have a take on that?
Could you just tell me again this definition of the new cosmopolitanism, because the connection was slightly bad for a moment.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Hang on, I'll just find it. It's in the questions now. I've lost it. She says, would you have any observations on the irony of the new cosmopolitans?
Yes.
Immigrants risking so much for what are often technologically enabled dreams of material goods available in more materially prosperous countries. So I think it comes back to that, thinking about the citizen of the world and the citizen of nowhere, and that dynamic is relevant to the present moment that we're living through.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. I think, you know, it's an excellent connection. I mean, obviously, you know, the link there is this notion of desire, but also of how, you know, how global connectivity comes into being and is constructed through the media. Let's put it this way, so that through the media and through commercialism. So I'm thinking, for example, I'm going back to the idea of world literature that I mentioned before. You know, so Goethe in the early 19th century, in the 1820s, 1830s, formulates this idea of world literature to try and think of how literature can be seen to operate internationally, of how, you know, kind of one can shift from a kind of an idea of literature tradition that is bounded by the nation to thinking about literature as a web, a kind of a set of connections that operate internationally. And in the mid 19th century, at the time of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels were already kind of appropriating Goethe's idea of world literature to think about how global capitalism, in fact, operates as a web. So so that's the connection between literature and the world and the kind of and the types of desire that what we now call globalization, that is the global circulation of goods and of wealth and of capital creates. So that's my kind of best way of answering that, in saying yes, there is a connection there, and that's to do with the parallel development of ideas of world citizenship and global free trade, global commerce, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I think what we'll do there is we'll draw the session to a close. Thank you so much to Stefano for giving a really fascinating talk. The video that Stefano made will be available on the website if you haven't had a chance to look at it. I'm hoping that the technical issues that have got in the way of some people accessing it resolved fairly soon. If you can't access it via the website, you can find it on YouTube, because it's just embedded on the website, so it doesn't depend on the website working, and you can find the videos there. And I sent a link in the email for passing on the Zoom links for this session. So thank you to Stefano for a wonderful presentation of our video, wonderful presentation today. Fantastically full and really interesting and stimulating answers in the questions too. One of the things I love about about your presentation and the way you've been talking today is in your presentation, I think I took a note because I could see the script that Stefano had sent me for the video presentation. You talk about investigating obstacles and how we overcome them in our critical practice. And I think you take that word obstacles from Tagore as well. And one of the things I liked about the presentation, and indeed the answers today, have been a sense of how live these issues are and how much they relate to our critical practice. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for attending. I'm going to end the session in a minute. There will be another session at 1:30 when we'll be hearing again from Alex Thompson, but also from Richard Hibbett, Benedict Costa, and Jerry Carruthers. There's a separate link for that if you've registered, you should be able to find in your email. And I'll see you all then. Thank you so much. And thank you, Stefano, again. And thank you all for your questions. Thank you.